I'm a woman of 60, and for 10 long years my only son Julian lived and worked in New York, a world away from our quiet Pasadena home. For most of that decade, he called us every single day, a ritual that brought joy to my husband Robert and me. But then, 2 years ago, his calls grew sporadic, his demeanor on video increasingly distant. Finally, a sudden, terrifying premonition pushed us to secretly visit him, and what we discovered shook us to our very core. It was a truth so shocking it brought us to tears, and forced us to make a resolute decision that changed everything. Please listen carefully to my story. Robert and I had just crossed the 60-year mark. Our lives, after years of building a successful family business, were finally content. We'd retired to a beautiful house in a quiet suburb, enjoying the fruits of our labor. Our greatest pride, our brightest light, was Julian. 10 years ago, he'd left for college on the East Coast and never returned, choosing to build his career there. 10 years had flown by, and for all that time, we could only see our son through a lifeless screen. Yet for me, 8 p.m. had become a sacred moment. That was when Julian would video call home. "Helen, it's almost 8. Where are you daydreaming again?" Robert's voice would call from the living room, pulling me from my thoughts as I admired the white roses blooming in the garden. I'd smile, quickly wipe my hands on my apron, and hurry inside. Robert would already be seated on the sofa, the iPad placed solemnly on the mahogany coffee table, its screen lit, waiting. "You say that as if I could forget." I'd grumble out of habit, but my eyes never left the screen. "I wonder if his work went well today. He's looked so thin lately." "You worry about nothing," Robert would say, taking a sip of tea, pretending to be profound. "Doing big things naturally requires a lot of hard work. He's a senior consultant on Wall Street now, not a little kid anymore. Every one of his contracts is worth millions of dollars. Do you understand? Of course, there's pressure." He said that, but I knew he was even more anxious than I was. At precisely 8, the iPad screen would vibrate, and Julian's familiar face would appear. My heart skipped a beat. Still the same neatly gelled hair, the gold-rimmed glasses, and a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit. Behind him, a massive glass wall overlooked the entire Manhattan skyline, skyscrapers twinkling. A top-floor office, luxurious and grand, just as we had always imagined. "Dad, Mom." Julian's voice was warm, tinged with that familiar fatigue. "Julian, my boy." I'd quickly press my face closer to the screen, trying to see my sis more clearly. "Have you had dinner? Is work very busy? Look at you. You've lost weight again. Your cheeks are all hollow." Julian would offer a light, professional smile that never seemed to reach his eyes. "I've eaten, Mom. Just a business dinner with partners. Don't worry, I'm fine. I just closed a big deal today, helping a German tech group with a successful merger." Robert would straighten his back, his eyes shining with pride. "Very good. What about that project you mentioned last time? The one with those Swiss bankers?" "Yes, that's also progressing smoothly. They really trust the proposal I put together. We'll probably sign the official contract next week." Julian would adjust his tie. "All right. I have to get to another meeting. It's a cross-conference call with the West Coast. Dad, Mom, take care of yourselves. You too," I'd say hurriedly. "Remember to wear enough clothes. Don't work too late." The call would end abruptly as usual, leaving me with a feeling that was both sweet and empty. The screen would go dark, reflecting the aging faces of us two old folks. Robert would let out a satisfied breath. "You see? Our son is truly one in a million. At 30 years old, how many people can achieve what he has? I bet it won't be long before he's promoted to managing director." I didn't say anything, just quietly tidied up the tea set. I had heard every word my husband said, and my chest swelled with pride. Every time I gathered with friends, I couldn't help but brag about Julian. I talked about his glamorous office, his expensive suits, and those million-dollar deals that I only vaguely understood myself. I became the focus of everyone's envy. The praise was endless. "Helen, you are so lucky. Your son is so handsome and talented. He's what so many people dream of. Your family is truly blessed." These words were as sweet as honey, soothing my deep longing for my son and filling the emptiness of this spacious house. We lived off our son's halo, off the image of Julian, who was successful and outstanding in that faraway city. That image was so flawless, so brilliant that it made us believe it was the whole truth. Last week, at a lunch with some old friends, Barbara, whose daughter had just married nearby, excitedly talked about how her son-in-law had personally cooked a birthday feast for his wife. "Oh, my girl is just so happy," she beamed. "It doesn't need to be some gourmet meal. Just having the family together is warm enough." Her casual remark stung my heart like a tiny needle. How long had it been since our family was together? An entire decade. Julian had never once come home for Thanksgiving. Every time the excuse was that work was too busy. He couldn't get away. The flights were all sold out. The project was in its final push. We understood. Our son's career came first. We couldn't let our own selfishness hold him back. But that night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. I looked at Robert sleeping beside me, his hair already mostly white. We weren't young anymore. How much longer did we have to wait? When would we be able to touch our real flesh and blood son, instead of just seeing him through a cold screen? A bold idea suddenly flashed in my mind. An idea that made my heart pound. The next morning, Robert was reading the paper in the garden. I brought out some tea, sat down next to him, and spoke in a decisive tone. Robert, what if we go to New York to see him? Robert was surprised, taking off his reading glasses. What did you say? Go there for what? That kid is incredibly busy. If we go, we'll just distract him, affect his work. But I miss him so much, my voice choked up. It's been 10 years, we can't just keep waiting. Your hair? My hair. It gets whiter every day. I just want to cook him a homemade meal, to see with my own eyes if he's really doing well. Don't you see him on video every day? Sharp suits, fancy office. If he's not doing well, who is? Robert waved his hand, but his gaze wavered. That's who he wants us to see, wants us. I raised my voice slightly, long suppressed feelings suddenly bursting out. I want to know how our son lives when he's not on a call. Don't you? Don't you want to hold a grandchild? He's 30 years old. Does he not even have a girlfriend? That last sentence hit Robert where it hurt. He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant gate. His son's career was his pride, but carrying on the family legacy was also his biggest worry. Finally, he put the newspaper down on the table, his voice deepening. But if we tell him we're coming, he'll just use work as an excuse again. I leaned forward, lowering my voice as if sharing a momentous secret. We don't tell him, we surprise him. 2 days later, we were on a plane to New York. The flight was long, filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. We landed, hailed a cab, and gave the driver the address of Julian's apartment, the one we knew from his video calls. It was a luxury building in a prime Manhattan location. My heart pounded with anticipation. What would he say? Would he be angry? Would he be happy? The doorman, a stern-looking man in a crisp uniform, eyed us suspiciously. Can I help you? We're here to see Julian Lee. Apartment 258, Robert said, trying to sound confident. The doorman checked his ledger. There's no Julian Lee in apartment 258. That apartment is currently vacant. My blood ran cold. Vacant? That's impossible. Our son, Julian Lee, has lived there for years. The doorman looked at us with a weary expression. Mom, I assure you, apartment 258 has been empty for over a year. The previous tenant, a Mr. Dean, moved out over a year ago. Are you sure you have the right address? A year? My mind reeled. For a year? Julian had been pretending to live in an apartment he no longer occupied. The luxurious office, the Manhattan skyline, all of it a lie. My legs felt weak. Robert put an arm around me, his face pale. We thanked the doorman numbly and stepped back out onto the bustling street. The city, once a symbol of our son's success, now felt cold and indifferent. We spent the next 2 hours in a daze, wandering aimlessly, our hearts heavy with a fear we couldn't articulate. Finally, Robert's phone rang. It was a friend who had managed to track down the contact information for Mr. Petrovich, the landlord who had rented apartment 258 to Julian. A tiny ray of light finally pierced the darkness. We met Mr. Petrovich at a nearby diner. He was an elderly man who seemed kind. After listening to Robert's brief explanation, he was very sympathetic. I remember Mr. Lee, Mr. Petrovich said in slow English. A very smart and polite young Asian man, always paid his rent on time. He was a perfect tenant. Then do you know why he suddenly moved out? I asked eagerly, my heart pounding. Mr. Petrovich took a sip of coffee, his eyes thoughtful. I'm not entirely sure. About a year ago, he came to me and said he needed to terminate the lease urgently. He looked very different, thin and pale. He didn't have that confidence anymore. He paused, then said something that made my heart stop. The strange thing is, he sold almost everything in the apartment. Sold it all to me very cheap. He said he needed cash fast. He also asked me something. What was it? Robert pressed. Mr. Petrovich looked directly into my eyes, his gaze full of sympathy. He asked me if I knew of any cheap rentals in the suburbs or dormitories for workers. Out in those industrial zones, dormitories for workers. My ears were ringing again. Mr. Petrovich's words matched every detail of my dream with terrifying accuracy. A muddy construction site, tattered clothes, calloused hands. Why would a high-level financial consultant be asking about worker dorms? It turned out the dream wasn't an omen. It was reality. Robert thanked Mr. Petrovich and carefully asked for the name of the industrial area Julian had mentioned. After leaving the diner, we immediately hailed another cab. To the industrial district in Queens, Robert told the driver, his voice heavy. The car started moving again, but this time in the completely opposite direction. We left the glittering skyscrapers and wide avenues behind. The car headed for the suburbs, and the scenery grew bleak. Factories with tall chimneys spewing gray smoke began to appear. In place of luxury apartments were old, run-down blocks, their paint peeling, their balconies hung with work clothes. This was a completely different world, worlds apart from the glamorous New York Julian had described to us. We stood at the entrance of the industrial district in Queens, like two lost souls who had just crash-landed on another planet. Where do we even start? I whispered, clutching my husband's arm. An invisible fear gripped my throat. Robert didn't answer right away. He looked around, his sharp eyes honed by years in business, searching desperately for a clue. The industrial park was vast, with dozens, maybe hundreds of factories and warehouses. Finding one person here was like finding a needle in a haystack. "Let's go," he finally said, his voice weary but resolute. "We'll walk and look." "In your dream, he was at a construction site, right?" I nodded automatically. Robert took my hand. We started walking. Two old, lonely figures moving through the streams of workers in safety vests and uniforms, all hurrying somewhere. They were either just getting off the noon shift or just starting a new one. They passed us by, an endless stream of unfamiliar, tired, weathered faces from all over the world. No one noticed the two elderly Asian people searching frantically for something. With every step on this road stained with grime and oil, my heart sank lower. Robert led me deeper into the district, toward a vast piece of land fenced off with corrugated metal where the noise was loudest, a construction site. My heart began to pound, matching the rhythm of the jackhammers in the distance. A feeling of both dread and a strange pull drew me toward it. We stood outside the metal fence, peering through a gap. Before us was a massive, chaotic scene. Mud was everywhere. A tangled web of rebar and scaffolding reached toward the gray sky. Excavators and bulldozers roared, moving back and forth like giant beasts. Hundreds of workers wearing hard hats and stained clothes were shouting, carrying, and toiling under the weak New York sun. This scene, why was it so familiar? It was exactly like my dream. I trembled, my eyes scanning the entire site, searching in vain. And then I saw him. My heart stopped. My throat went dry. All the noise of the world faded away. In the midst of a group of strange workers, there was one thin figure, noticeably smaller than the rest, struggling to carry several long, heavy iron bars on his shoulder. He was wearing a faded blue uniform, caked with cement and dirt. The yellow hard hat nearly obscured his entire face. But the way he staggered, the way his back bent under the heavy load, it was so familiar, so heartbreaking. At that very moment, the man stopped to catch his breath. He used a thin, dark arm to wipe the sweat pouring from his forehead. The hard hat tilted back slightly. I saw his face clearly. Julian, my dear son, the pride of my life, the one I always thought was sitting in an air-conditioned office, pointing at complex financial charts. It was him, but that face was no longer the pale, sophisticated face behind intellectual glasses. It was a gaunt face, weathered dark by the sun and wind. His cheekbones stuck out sharply. His lips were chapped. Only his eyes were the same, those large, intelligent eyes. But now they no longer sparkled with confidence and pride. They were filled with exhaustion, resignation, and a bottomless despair. The shock was too great. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen, watching our son. It felt like an eternity. Robert, usually so composed, was trembling beside me. His hand gripping mine was clammy. Finally, he pulled me away, his voice a raw whisper. We can't confront him here. Not like this. We found a small, rundown motel nearby, the kind that smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. The room was dingy, but we barely noticed. All we could see was Julian's face, etched with pain and exhaustion. We sat on the edge of the bed, silent, the weight of his secret crushing us. The perfect image of our son, the Wall Street success, shattered into a million pieces. That night, I cried until there were no more tears left. Robert held me, his own silent tears wetting my hair. We talked for hours, piecing together the fragments of what we now knew. Julian had lost everything. The high-flying career, the luxury apartment, the pride. He had fallen, and instead of telling us, he had built an elaborate facade, a lie he maintained for a year, just to spare us the pain. The next morning, we decided we couldn't leave without talking to him. We couldn't just abandon him in his despair. But how? We couldn't go to the construction site again. We needed a quiet place, a neutral ground. Robert remembered Julian mentioning a small coffee shop near his old apartment building, a place he used to grab breakfast. We went there, hoping against hope. We waited for hours, nursing lukewarm coffee, our eyes glued to the entrance. Just as we were about to give up, he walked in, not in a suit, but in a clean but worn work shirt and jeans. He looked tired, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a quiet determination we hadn't seen on the construction site. He ordered a black coffee and sat down alone at a small table. Robert stood up first, his voice surprisingly steady. Julian froze. He slowly turned and his eyes, those familiar intelligent eyes, widened in disbelief, then filled with a mixture of shock, shame, and a profound sadness. Dad, Mom? What are you doing here? I couldn't hold back my tears. Julian, my son. I rushed to him, wrapping my arms around him, holding him tight. He was so thin, so fragile. He buried his face in my shoulder, and I felt his body shake with silent sobs. We sat there for a long time, just holding each other. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were red, but there was a faint glimmer of relief. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to disappoint you. And then he told us everything. A little over a year ago, a major financial deal he was leading had gone terribly wrong. A sudden market crash, A miscalculation, a chain of unfortunate events. He had lost everything, his job, his savings, his reputation. He was blacklisted in the industry. He tried to find another job, but no one would hire him. He used up his remaining savings, sold his apartment, and moved to a cheap room in Queens. He took on any work he could find, eventually ending up on construction sites, doing manual labor to survive. He had been too ashamed, too proud, to tell us. He kept up the charade, borrowing money from friends to maintain the illusion of success during our video calls, using old photos of his office as backgrounds. He just couldn't bear to shatter our dreams for him. My heart ached with a pain deeper than any physical wound. But beneath the pain there was also a fierce surge of love and admiration. My son, despite his fall, had not given up. He had faced his failure head-on, picked himself up from the lowest point, and was working to rebuild his life, brick by brick with his own hands. "Julian," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion, "why didn't you tell us? So were your parents. We would have helped you." Julian looked down at his calloused hands. "I know, but I needed to do this myself. I needed to find my own way back. I needed to prove to myself that I could stand on my own 2 feet, even after everything." We spent the next few days with Julian. We cooked for him. We listened. We simply were there. We saw the true New York, the one beyond the glittering facade. We saw his small, humble room, the worn clothes, the tired but resilient spirit. And in that raw honesty, our love for him deepened, becoming purer, stronger. We returned to Pasadena with a new understanding, a new perspective. Julian chose not to return with us. He wanted to finish what he started, to rebuild his life in New York, on his own terms. We respected his decision, but this time we were truly connected. We called him every day, not for a performance but for real conversations. We sent him money, not as charity but as an investment in his future, in the man he was becoming. A few months later, Julian called with exciting news. He had found a new path. He had always loved art, especially pottery, a hobby he'd pursued in college. He had stumbled into a small riverside pottery studio and was captivated by the exquisite rustic and artistic ceramic pieces. And there he met the studio's owner, Claras, my son, a man who had clawed his way through the calculating world of finance, was mesmerized by a single image. A girl in a simple linen dress, her dark hair pinned up, sitting at the potter's wheel. Her slender hands were gently shaping a lifeless piece of clay. My son said he had never seen such a peaceful and beautiful sight. They talked for hours about pottery, about art, about life. Julian bought a tea set as a gift for us and also used it as an excuse to get her contact information. A month later, Julian brought Clara home to meet us. The first time I saw her, I had a special feeling about this girl. Clara had a gentle, graceful beauty, but what impressed me most were her eyes. They were clear, intelligent, and sparkled with strength and independence. At the dinner table, when I casually mentioned how hard Julian had worked to rebuild his career, Clara looked at my son with eyes full of love and admiration. After dinner, when it was just the two of us in the kitchen, she quietly said something to me that I will never forget. "Mom," Clara said, deftly washing the teacups. Our second date, Julian told me his whole story, including those years in New York, about the failure and the days working on the construction site. I was stunned. I never expected my son would have the courage to tell a girl he'd just met about the most shameful period of his life. Clara smiled gently. I was surprised at first too. But you know, Mom, it was that story that truly made me fall for him. Other girls might admire the Mr. Lee he is today, but I admire the Julian he was. A man who dares to face his most painful failure, who dares to cast aside all pride to start again from the bottom. That is a man who is truly strong and dependable. Hearing those words, I couldn't hold back my tears. I knew my son had finally found the right person. Clara loved Julian, not for his halo of success. She loved his scars. She loved the resilience he had forged from his failure. Their love was built on truth and understanding. A love that nothing could shake. A year later, a warm wedding was held. No extravagance, no luxury, just family and the closest of friends. Watching Julian and Clara stand together, exchanging vows, Robert and I looked at each other and smiled. Our hearts full. The biggest storm of my son's life was finally over. Now it was time for the rainbow. Time flies. Julian and Clara used their own savings to buy a small house near us. The house isn't large, but it's decorated with an exceptional warmth and elegance, filled with beautiful ceramic art that Clara made herself. Today is the weekend, and my husband and I are going to the kids' house for dinner. Sitting on the comfortable sofa in their living room, looking out at the small green garden, I feel a sense of completeness and peace I have never felt before. Laughter echoes from the kitchen. I walk over curiously to see, and a sight melts my heart. My son Julian is wearing an apron, somewhat clumsily, chopping vegetables, turning his head every so often to tease his wife. Clara is skillfully seasoning the soup, laughing non-stop at her husband's adorable clumsiness. The gentle afternoon sun streams through the window, casting a warm golden halo around the two of them, huddled together. It's an ordinary scene, But to me, it is more precious than all the million-dollar contracts, all the high-level director titles. The glamour of a career can be brilliant, but it can also vanish in an instant. Only the warmth of family and the happiness of a home are eternal. I quietly return to the living room and sit down next to Robert. He is also looking toward the kitchen, his aged eyes shining with happiness. He gently takes my hand. We say nothing, but we both understand. We once had a false pride built on lies and vanity. We once fell into an abyss of disappointment and fear. But it was from those ashes of the past that my family learned how to love with forgiveness, how to face the truth, and how to find the real value of life. Looking at the radiant smiles on my sons and daughter-in-law's faces, my heart is filled with an unprecedented peace. Finally, after all the storms, my family has found true happiness. A happiness that doesn't need to be shown off to anyone. A simple happiness rebuilt from brokenness and love.